Pearl MacIntyre dug her nails into her palm as the stagecoach rattled over another bump, keeping her eyes fixed on the dust-swirled horizon of Wyoming Territory, 1878. The letter in her pocket, the one announcing Thomas had left for California, without her crinkled with every jostle, a constant reminder that promises were as fragile as autumn leaves. "First time out west, miss?" The elderly woman beside her smiled kindly, her wrinkled hands folded neatly over a worn Bible. Pearl nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd left everything behind in Boston: her teaching position, her mother's disapproval, and the shattered pieces of a 3-year courtship that had ended with Thomas's hastily scrawled note. Found better prospects in Gold Country. Don't follow. White Rock's not much, the woman continued, but it's got good people. You'll find your footing. Pearl managed to smile. What she didn't say was that footing was exactly what she'd lost. At 24, she was starting over with nothing but 2 trunks of belongings and an offer to teach in a frontier town she'd never seen. The stagecoach lurched violently, followed by a sharp crack. Pearl grabbed the wooden seat as they tilted dangerously to one side. Wheels broke. The driver shouted from above. "Everybody out while we fix it." Pearl stepped down into ankle-deep dust, shielding her eyes against the merciless sun. They had stopped in what appeared to be absolute nowhere, just endless prairie stretching in every direction, broken only by the rutted trail and distant purple mountains. "Madam, you might want to move back a bit." The deep voice came from behind her, startling Pearl from her thoughts. She turned to find herself looking up at a tall man in a dusty brown hat. His face was tanned and weathered, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue, like winter sky, watching her with quiet intensity. "The coach tends to shift when they jack it up," he explained, nodding toward where the driver and his assistant were already assessing the damage. "Thank you, Mr. Isaac Blackwood." He touched the brim of his hat. "Heading to White Rock myself. Pearl MacIntyre." She offered her hand automatically, then immediately regretted it. Her gloves were packed away, and her hands were hardly in a ladle-like condition after days of travel. But Isaac took her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "The new schoolteacher, I reckon? Word travels fast, it seems." A slight smile crossed his face. "Not much happens in White Rock that folks don't know about before it arrives." The driver interrupted their conversation with a string of colorful curses. Axles cracked clean through. "We ain't going nowhere till morning, when the relief coach comes through." A chorus of complaints rose from the other passengers. Pearl felt her stomach sink. Another night delayed meant another night of expensive lodging costs she could ill afford. "Where exactly are we supposed to stay?" asked a portly businessman, gesturing at the empty landscape. "Coulter's Creek is about 3 miles west," Isaac said, pointing to a barely visible line of trees in the distance. "Small trading post there. Has rooms. 3 miles in this heat." The businessman mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "I can ride ahead and send back a wagon," Isaac offered. Pearl found herself studying him more carefully. He wasn't dressed like the cowboy she'd read about in dime novels, no flashy pistols or jingling spurs. His clothes were practical and worn. Canvas trousers, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen countless miles. The only weapon visible was a knife sheathed at his belt. Within half an hour, Isaac had departed on a sturdy bay horse that had been tied to the back of the stagecoach. Pearl watched him ride away, his straight-backed figure growing smaller against the vast emptiness of the prairie. "That man saved more folks than the good Lord himself in these parts," the elderly woman commented, seeing Pearl's gaze. "Been through hell and back, if the stories are true." "What stories?" Pearl asked, curiosity piqued despite her exhaustion. "War, mostly. They say he rode with Sherman, then came west to forget." She shook her head. "But some things don't stay forgot, do they?" Before Pearl could inquire further, a distant dust cloud announced the return of Isaac, leading a farm wagon pulled by 2 mules. The driver began transferring luggage while the passengers climbed aboard the rough conveyance. Pearl found herself seated next to Isaac, who handled the reins with quiet competence. Up close, she noticed a thin scar that ran along his jawline, disappearing into his collar. "You've been to White Rock before?" she asked, trying to distract herself from both the heat and the strange awareness of his proximity. "I live outside town." Got a small horse ranch about 5 miles north. His eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead. It's not Boston, madam. I'm not expecting Boston, Pearl replied, surprised. How did you know I'm from Boston? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Your accent gives you away. That, and those shoes aren't made for Wyoming dirt. Pearl glanced down at her once fine leather boots, now coated with a layer of prairie dust. I suppose I'll need to adjust my wardrobe. Most folks do. They lapsed into silence as the wagon creaked its way toward Coulter's Creek. Pearl found herself grateful for the quiet. Isaac Blackwood didn't seem inclined toward unnecessary conversation, and after days of being confined with chattering strangers, the silence felt like a luxury. Coulter's Creek turned out to be little more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around a stagnant bend in what must have once been a creek, but was now barely a trickle. The trading post doubled as a way station, with several small rooms available for rent. Only got 3 rooms. The proprietor, a grizzled man with a missing front tooth, announced. You folks will have to double up. Pearl felt a flash of panic at the thought of sharing quarters with a stranger, but the elderly woman who had introduced herself as Mrs. Abernathy quickly volunteered to share with her. A teacher and a preacher's widow ought to be respectable enough company, she declared. The rooms were Spartan, at best a sagging bed, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a single chair, but after the jarring stagecoach journey, Pearl was grateful for any place to rest. She carefully hung her travel dress on a nail protruding from the wall and changed into her nightgown, acutely aware of Mrs. Abernathy's presence on the other side of the thin partition. You married, child? Mrs. Abernathy asked as they prepared for bed. No, Pearl replied, the single syllable carrying more weight than it should. I was engaged once. The old woman didn't press for details. Well, Wyoming Territory's got more men than it knows what to do with. And that Blackwood fellow seemed to take a shine to you. We barely exchanged 10 sentences, Pearl protested. For a man like that, it's practically a courtship. Mrs. Abernathy chuckled. Saw him watching you when you weren't looking. Man doesn't watch a woman like that unless he's interested. Pearl dismissed the observation, attributing it to an old woman's romantic imagination. Isaac Blackwood had been polite, nothing more. Besides, she hadn't come west to find a husband, especially not after Thomas had proven how unreliable men's promises could be. She fell asleep to the sound of coyotes calling in the distance, their mournful cries carrying across the empty prairie like lost souls searching for home. Morning brought chaos as passengers attempted to transfer their belongings to the relief stagecoach. Pearl found herself struggling with her heaviest trunk when Isaac appeared at her side, lifting it easily onto the coach. Thank you, she said, brushing dust from her gloves. She'd managed to unpack them, along with a fresh collar that somewhat brightened her travel-worn appearance. Heading to town today? He asked, securing the trunk with practiced efficiency. Yes, I'm expected at the schoolhouse tomorrow morning. Isaac nodded. School board's been waiting on a teacher since spring. Last one left after a run-in with a rattlesnake in the privy. Pearl's eyes widened. Was she injured? He wasn't, Isaac corrected. But he claimed Wyoming was too uncivilized for proper education and took the next coach east. Well, I'm made of sturdier stuff, I hope, Pearl said, though privately she wondered what other trials awaited her in White Rock. I believe you are, Miss MacIntyre. Something in his tone made her look up sharply, but his expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest. The remainder of the journey passed without incident, and by mid-afternoon, the stagecoach rolled into White Rock. Pearl's first impression was one of dust and impermanence, a single wide street lined with false-fronted buildings, some still raw with new lumber, others weathered to a silvery gray. A few horses stood hitched before the largest building, which proclaimed itself the White Rock Hotel and Saloon in faded letters. School board chairman will be waiting for you there, the driver informed her, pointing to a modest 2-story building with a small bell tower. That's Humphrey's General Store. He's head of the school committee. Pearl gathered her smaller bag, leaving the trunks to be delivered later. As she stepped down from the coach, she was keenly aware of curious stares from passers-by. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, but a new schoolteacher was clearly a matter of community interest. You must be Miss MacIntyre. A portly man with magnificent whiskers hurried toward her, hand extended. Walter Humphrey, at your service. We're mighty pleased you've arrived safely. Thank you, Mr. Humphrey. I'm eager to see the schoolhouse. Of course, of course. But first, let me show you to your accommodations. We've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, very respectable, I assure you. Pearl followed Mr. Humphrey down the dusty street, trying to absorb the sights and sounds of what would now be her home. Children darted between buildings, dogs barked lazily from shaded porches, and somewhere, a piano played a slightly off-key rendition of Beautiful Dreamer. Mrs. Wilson's boarding house proved to be a neat white building with green shutters, set slightly apart from the main street. The widow Wilson herself, a brisk, bird-like woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, showed Pearl to a small but clean room on the second floor. Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6 in the evening, Mrs. Wilson recited. No gentlemen callers in rooms, no alcohol on premises, and laundry day is Monday. Any questions? Pearl shook her head, somewhat overwhelmed by the rapid-fire instructions. Good. Mr. Humphrey will return at 4 to show you the schoolhouse. Rest until then, you look like you need it. Left alone, Pearl sank onto the narrow bed and allowed herself a moment of doubt. She was thousands of miles from everything familiar, in a town that seemed to exist on the very edge of civilization. Had she made a terrible mistake in coming west? Then her fingers brushed against Thomas's letter in her pocket, and her resolve hardened. She had already survived one heartbreak. Whatever White Rock had in store for her, she would face it with the same determination that had brought her this far. The schoolhouse, when she saw it later that afternoon, was both better and worse than she had feared. A simple one-room building with a pot-bellied stove, it boasted new glass windows and relatively sturdy desks. However, it was desperately short on books and teaching materials. We've ordered more readers from back east, Mr. Humphrey assured her, but freight's slow this time of year. You'll have about 20 pupils when harvest season ends, ages 6 to 16. And what curriculum am I expected to follow? Pearl asked, already planning how to group the students by ability rather than age. Mr. Humphrey looked momentarily confused. Well, reading, writing, figures, I suppose. And whatever else you deem appropriate, Miss MacIntyre. We trust your judgment, that's why we hired you. The responsibility was both daunting and exhilarating. In Boston, Pearl had taught under the watchful eye of a headmistress who scrutinized every lesson plan. Here, it seemed, she would have almost complete autonomy. School starts Monday next, Mr. Humphrey continued. Gives you a few days to settle in. Oh, and there's the social on Saturday, good chance for you to meet the community. Social? Pearl repeated. Harvest dance at the Grange Hall. Nothing fancy, but folks come from miles around. Good way for you to get acquainted before school starts. Pearl nodded, though the prospect of a social gathering filled her with apprehension. She had packed little in the way of appropriate attire for such events, having assumed that frontier life would be decidedly lacking in social occasions. The weekend arrived more quickly than Pearl anticipated, filled as it was with preparations for the school term. She spent hours organizing what meager supplies were available, sweeping out the dusty corners of the schoolhouse, and preparing lessons that could accommodate students of widely varying abilities. Saturday evening found her standing before the small mirror in her boarding house room, assessing her appearance with a critical eye. She had managed to press her best dress, a dark blue poplin with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs, but it was clearly a Boston dress, designed for cool drawing rooms rather than frontier dances. You'll do fine, Mrs. Wilson said, appearing in the doorway. The normally stern landlady's expression had softened slightly. It's not a fancy affair, just folks getting together before the winter sets in. The Grange Hall was already buzzing with activity when Pearl arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. A small group of musicians, 2 fiddlers, an accordion player, and a man with a banjo occupied one corner, while tables laden with food lined another wall. Miss MacIntyre. Mr. Humphrey waved her over, eager to begin introductions. Come meet the school board and some of your future pupils. What followed was a blur of names and faces. The blacksmith whose twin daughters would be in her class, the banker whose son needed extra attention to his figures, the doctor who served on the school board and offered apologetically to address female matters should any arise among the older girls. Pearl smiled and nodded, trying to commit each name to memory while simultaneously fielding questions about her qualifications, her journey west, and most persistently her marital status. "A pretty young thing like you won't stay single long out here," declared Mrs. Humphrey, a plump woman with a calculating gleam in her eye. "We've got 3 eligible bachelors for every unmarried lady in the county." "I'm devoted to my teaching," Pearl replied firmly. "Romance is not my priority at present." "Of course, dear." Mrs. Humphrey patted her hand indulgently. "Now, have you met Sheriff Patterson? Widower, no children, owns his own home." Pearl was saved from this matchmaking attempt by the start of the dancing. The musicians struck up a lively reel, and couples quickly filled the floor. "May I have this dance, Miss MacIntyre?" A young man with slicked back hair and an eager smile appeared at her elbow. "Jim Caldwell, at your service. My ranch is just south of town." Before Pearl could formulate a polite refusal, she found herself swept onto the dance floor. Jim Caldwell proved to be an enthusiastic, if somewhat clumsy dancer, stepping on her toes twice while maintaining a steady stream of conversation about his cattle prospects and recent improvements to his property. "Building a new room on the house," he informed her as they circled the floor. "A man needs to expand when he's thinking about a family." The hint was about as subtle as a branding iron, and Pearl felt a wave of dismay. Had she escaped one unwanted romance only to be thrust into another? The dance ended, but before she could retreat to the refreshment table, another partner claimed her, this time the middle-aged banker, whose conversation centered entirely on the deficiencies of the previous schoolteacher and his hopes that Pearl would instill proper discipline. By her third dance, Pearl was searching desperately for an excuse to step outside for air. Her fourth partner, whose name she had already forgotten, was describing in excruciating detail the proper way to butcher a hog when she caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the doorway. Isaac Blackwood looked decidedly uncomfortable in the crowded hall. He had exchanged his trail clothes for a clean dark shirt and newer trousers, but he still wore the same weathered boots and carried himself with the same quiet alertness she had noticed during their journey. Their eyes met across the room, and Pearl felt an unexpected flutter of recognition, not of his face, but of his obvious discomfort with the social gathering. He gave her a slight nod before turning his attention to an older man who was speaking animatedly at his side. When the dance ended, Pearl excused herself and made her way toward the door, desperate for a moment of quiet. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, a welcome relief after the stuffy heat of the crowded hall. "Not what you expected from Frontier Entertainment." Isaac's voice came from the shadows of the porch. Pearl started, then smiled as he stepped into the pool of light spilling from the doorway. "I didn't see you come outside. Needed some air." He leaned against a post, looking more at ease now that he was away from the crowd. "You've been popular tonight. Apparently, a new schoolteacher is quite the novelty." "It's not just that." His direct gaze made her cheeks warm. "Single women are scarce out here, especially educated ones. So I've been informed, repeatedly." Pearl couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "Mr. Caldwell was kind enough to mention his house expansion plans within 2 minutes of introduction." Isaac's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Jim moves fast. Been looking for a wife since he arrived 3 years ago. Well, he can look elsewhere." Pearl immediately regretted the sharpness of her tone. "I mean, I came here to teach, not to I understand." Isaac cut her off with a nod. "Though you might want to make that clearer to some of them. Men out here don't always catch subtle hints." A comfortable silence fell between them. From inside, the music had changed to a slower waltz, the melancholy notes drifting out into the night. "Would you like to dance, Miss MacIntyre?" Isaac asked suddenly. Pearl looked up, surprised by the offer. "Here, less crowded." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Pearl placed her fingers in his palm. There on the moonlit porch, with the music filtering softly through the open door, they began to waltz. Isaac's hand was warm at her waist, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man who spent his days on horseback. "You dance well, Mr. Blackwood." "My mother insisted. Said no son of hers would stomp around like a bear, even on a ranch." His voice held a note of fondness that softened his usual reserve. "She sounds formidable." She was. The past tense hung between them, but Pearl didn't press. They completed the dance in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the first Pearl had experienced since leaving Boston. When the music ended, Isaac stepped back, releasing her with a slight bow that spoke of good breeding beneath his frontier exterior. "Thank you for the dance, Miss MacIntyre." "Pearl," she said impulsively. "Please call me Pearl." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Pearl." The way he said her name carefully, as if testing its weight, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The door burst open, spilling light and noise onto the porch as several young men tumbled out, laughing raucously. The moment shattered, and Isaac stepped back into the shadows. "I should get back to my ranch," he said. "Long ride." "Of course." Pearl was surprised by her reluctance to see him go. "Thank you again for the dance." He touched the brim of his hat, then descended the steps and disappeared around the corner of the building. Pearl remained on the porch for a moment longer, puzzled by the strange sense of connection she had felt with a man who was, for all intents and purposes, still a stranger. The first day of school arrived with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Pearl stood at the door of the schoolhouse, watching as children began to arrive, some on foot, others on horseback or in wagons driven by parents eager to meet the new teacher. By 8 o'clock, 19 students of various ages were seated at the desks, eyeing her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. Pearl took a deep breath and rang the small handbell that would become a fixture of their daily routine. "Good morning," she began, smiling at her new pupils. "I am Miss MacIntyre, and I am very pleased to meet each of you." The morning proceeded more smoothly than she had dared hope. After assessing each student's abilities, Pearl divided them into groups based on their reading and arithmetic skills rather than strictly by age. She assigned the older students to help the younger ones with basic tasks, freeing her to work more closely with those who needed additional attention. By the time the lunch hour arrived, Pearl felt cautiously optimistic. The children were generally well-behaved, if somewhat behind in their studies compared to their Boston counterparts. More importantly, they seemed eager to learn, particularly once Pearl introduced them to the small collection of books she had brought from the East. As the children scattered to eat their packed lunches in the schoolyard, Pearl noticed a rider approaching the tall figure and bay horse immediately recognizable. Isaac dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, then walked toward the schoolhouse with a small package tucked under one arm. "Mr. Blackwood," Pearl greeted him, stepping onto the porch. "What brings you to town?" "Supply run." He gestured toward the general store down the street. "Thought you might be able to use these." He held out the package, which proved to be a stack of slate tablets. "Found them in my attic. Previous owner of the ranch was a teacher back east, I think." "These are perfect," Pearl exclaimed, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the top slate. "We have so few supplies, the children have been sharing the few we have." "It's not much," Isaac said, looking slightly uncomfortable with her enthusiasm. "It's exactly what we need." "Thank you." She smiled up at him, noticing how the sunlight brought out flecks of gray in his blue eyes. He nodded, his gaze moving past her to the children playing in the yard. "How's the first day going?" "Better than expected." "They're bright children, just lacking in consistent instruction. Figured you'd do well with them." The simple vote of confidence warmed her more than it should have. One of the younger girls had approached cautiously, staring up at Isaac with undisguised curiosity. "Are you Miss MacIntyre's beau?" she asked bluntly. Pearl felt heat rush to her face. "Lily Montgomery." "That's not an appropriate question." Isaac's expression remained impassive, but Pearl thought she detected a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Just a neighbor bringing school supplies, Miss Montgomery," he answered gravely. Lily looked skeptical but was distracted by a call from her friends. She ran off, leaving Pearl mortified. "I apologize for that," she said. "Children at this age are rather direct." "No harm done." Isaac touched the brim of his hat. "I should let you get back to your students. Just wanted to drop these by. Thank you again. It was very thoughtful." He nodded and turned to go, then paused. "There's a creek on my property with good fishing. If you wanted to bring the older students sometime, might be educational." "That would be wonderful," Pearl said, surprised by the offer. "Natural science is difficult to teach from books alone. Just let me know when. I'm around most days." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Pearl wondering about the complex man behind the reserved exterior. The following weeks fell into a steady rhythm. Mornings and afternoons were filled with lessons, while evenings were devoted to grading, preparing materials, and occasionally socializing with the few other single women in town, primarily the dressmaker's assistant and the telegraph operator's niece, both of whom had become friendly acquaintances, if not close friends. Pearl found herself watching for Isaac whenever she went into town, though their encounters remained brief and largely centered around school matters. He had delivered several books on native plants and animals, and true to his word, had hosted the older students for a day of practical science lessons at his creek, showing remarkable patience as he taught them to identify different fish species and explain the creek's ecosystem. What struck Pearl most was how differently he behaved with the children compared to most adults. With them, his usual reserve softened, and he displayed a natural teaching ability that surprised her. He answered their endless questions with consideration, never dismissing their curiosity as trivial. "You would have made an excellent teacher, Mr. Blackwood," she commented as they watched the students cataloging plant specimens along the creek bank. He shook his head. "Don't have the patience for it day in and day out. Besides, horses are easier to understand than people. I find that hard to believe, given how well you work with my students." He shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with the compliment. "Children are honest, at least. Say what they mean. Unlike adults?" Pearl prompted. His gaze met hers, unexpectedly intense. Most adults spend their lives hiding behind words, saying one thing, meaning another. There was something personal in the statement that made Pearl wonder what experiences had led to such a view. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by excited shouts as the children discovered a turtle sunning itself on a rock. As autumn deepened into winter, the harsh realities of frontier life became increasingly apparent. The first heavy snowfall came in early November, making the 3-mile walk from town to school treacherous for the children who lived on outlying farms. After one particularly brutal storm, only 8 students made it to class. Pearl was walking back to her boarding house through knee-deep snow when a wagon pulled up beside her, Isaac at the reins. "Get in," he said without preamble. "This storm's getting worse." Pearl didn't argue. The temperature had dropped precipitously in the last hour, and the wind was whipping snow into blinding sheets. She accepted his hand up into the wagon, noticing that he had lined the seat with thick buffalo robes. "Thank you," she said, pulling the robe up to her chin. "I didn't realize how quickly the weather was turning. Wyoming winters don't give much warning." He clicked to the horses, urging them through the deepening snow. "You shouldn't be walking in this." "I don't have many alternatives," Pearl pointed out. "Unless you're suggesting I cancel school at the first snowflake." He shot her a sideways glance. "Plenty of teachers would." "I'm not plenty of teachers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, you're not." They reached Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, but as Pearl prepared to climb down, Isaac put a hand on her arm. "Wait, I've been meaning to ask you something." Pearl turned, surprised by the uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. "Christmas is coming," he continued. "Thought you might want to join me for dinner. Nothing fancy, but—" He trailed off, looking unaccountably uncomfortable. "Christmas dinner?" Pearl repeated, taken aback by the invitation. "Just the two of us. Unless you've got other plans." His expression had closed again, becoming unreadable. Pearl thought of the boarding house's promised Christmas meal, a slightly more elaborate version of their usual fare, shared with the 3 elderly gentlemen who were Mrs. Wilson's only other permanent residents. It was a depressing prospect for her first Christmas away from family. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "Thank you." He nodded, visibly relaxing. "Good. I'll come for you around noon, if that suits." "It does." Pearl hesitated, then added, "Why did you ask me, Isaac?" He met her gaze directly. Nobody should be alone at Christmas, especially not someone far from home. The simple statement, delivered without sentiment or elaboration, touched Pearl more deeply than any flowery declaration could have. It spoke of a man who understood loneliness and recognized it in others. "Thank you," she said again, unable to find more adequate words. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood facing each other in the swirling snow, and Pearl had the strange sensation that something important had shifted between them. Then Isaac stepped back, touching his hat in his customary gesture. "Stay warm, Pearl," he said, before climbing back into the wagon and driving away. Pearl stood watching until the wagon disappeared into the white haze, a curious warmth spreading through her despite the bitter cold. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy ones. Besides her teaching duties, Pearl found herself roped into helping with the town's holiday celebrations, decorating the church, organizing a small pageant with her students, and even assisting Mrs. Humphrey with baking what seemed like an endless procession of pies for various community gatherings. Throughout it all, her thoughts frequently returned to Isaac's invitation. They had seen each other only briefly since that snowy day once at the general store, where their conversation was limited to polite inquiries about health and weather, and once when he had brought a load of firewood to the schoolhouse, just in case. As he put it, the regular delivery was delayed by snow. Pearl found herself both anticipating and apprehensive about spending Christmas Day in his company. She had come to respect Isaac Blackwood greatly, and their few conversations had revealed a depth of character and intelligence that intrigued her. But there was still so much about him she didn't know, and, more troublingly, she wasn't entirely sure of her own feelings toward him. Thomas's betrayal had left wounds that were still healing. The thought of trusting another man with her heart seemed dangerously foolish. Yet she couldn't deny that Isaac stirred something in her that Thomas never had, a sense of safety combined with a flutter of excitement whenever their eyes met. Christmas morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Pearl dressed with particular care in her best dress, a dark green wool that she had altered slightly to better suit current fashions. She had even splurged on a small bottle of rose water, dabbing it lightly at her wrists and throat. Mrs. Wilson eyed her approvingly as she came downstairs. "My, don't you look nice, Miss MacIntyre? Special plans today. Mr. Blackwood invited me to Christmas dinner," Pearl admitted, feeling oddly shy about the arrangement. Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Did he now? Well. A knowing smile spread across her face. "Isaac Blackwood doesn't socialize much. Must think highly of you." Before Pearl could respond to this assessment, a knock at the door announced Isaac's arrival. He stood on the porch, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright snow. He had dressed for the occasion as well. Pearl noted a new-looking dark coat over a clean white shirt, his hair neatly trimmed. "Merry Christmas," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. His eyes took in her appearance with quiet appreciation. "You look lovely." "Thank you. Merry Christmas to you too." Pearl was suddenly conscious of Mrs. Wilson watching them with undisguised interest. "I just need to get my coat." The drive to Isaac's ranch took nearly an hour, giving Pearl ample opportunity to appreciate the stark beauty of the winter landscape. The snow-covered prairie stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it, while the distant mountains stood sharp and clear in the crystalline air. "It's beautiful," Pearl said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I never imagined winter could be so bright." "It's the light that gets most people," Isaac agreed. "No haze, no buildings to block it. Just snow and sky." His ranch, when they arrived, was a pleasant surprise. The main house was larger than Pearl had expected, a solidly built two-story structure of weathered logs with a wide porch. Several outbuildings, including a substantial barn, were arranged nearby, and smoke rose invitingly from the stone chimney. "It's not what I pictured," Pearl admitted as he helped her down from the wagon. "What did you picture?" "Something smaller, I suppose. More temporary." Isaac led the horses toward the barn. "Previous owner built it. Family man with big plans. When his wife died in childbirth, he couldn't stand to stay. Sold it to me for half what it's worth just to get away." The casual mention of tragedy struck Pearl forcibly. How many stories like that were hidden behind the facades of frontier homes? How many dreams had ended in heartbreak on this beautiful, unforgiving land? The interior of the house was unexpectedly welcoming. The main room boasted a massive stone fireplace where a log fire crackled cheerfully. The furnishings were simple but solid: a long table of polished pine, several comfortable-looking chairs, and bookshelves that lined one entire wall, filled with volumes that made Pearl's fingers itch to explore them. "You have a beautiful home," she said sincerely, unbuttoning her coat. "It suits me." Isaac took her coat, hanging it carefully on a peg by the door. "Make yourself comfortable. Dinner's almost ready." Pearl couldn't help but register surprise. "You cooked?" A glint of amusement warmed his eyes. "Did you think cowboys can't cook? How do you imagine we survive on cattle drives?" "I hadn't really considered it," Pearl admitted. Though I suppose I pictured a lot of beans eaten directly from cans. Sometimes, he acknowledged. But not for Christmas. The meal he had prepared was impressive by any standard: roast venison with cranberry sauce, potatoes, winter squash, fresh bread, and an apple pie that filled the house with its cinnamon fragrance. "This is wonderful," Pearl said after taking her first bite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother, mostly. After she died, I was on my own a lot. Father was occupied elsewhere." Something in his tone suggested this was a deliberate understatement. Pearl recognized the opening for what it was: an invitation to ask more about his past. "How old were you when she died?" 14. Isaac cut a piece of venison with precise movements. "Influenza took her in 3 days. Father started drinking after that. Didn't really stop until the day he died." "I'm so sorry." The words felt inadequate for the loss they represented. Isaac shrugged slightly. "It was a long time ago. What about your family? You mentioned Boston, but not much else." Pearl told him about her childhood in a respectable but not wealthy Boston household, her father's early death, her mother's struggle to maintain their social position on a reduced income, and her own decision to pursue teaching rather than an advantageous marriage. "Mother still hasn't quite forgiven me for choosing career over a suitable match," she concluded. "She was horrified when I accepted this position." "And now?" Isaac asked. "What does she think of your Wyoming adventure?" Pearl smiled ruefully. "In her last letter, she expressed hope that I would come to my senses before frostbite claims my extremities or savages claim my scalp." Isaac's laugh was unexpected and transformative, lighting his face in a way that made him appear years younger. "Not much danger of either in White Rock, I'd say." "No," Pearl agreed, finding herself captivated by this glimpse of a less guarded Isaac. "Though the children might claim my sanity if Freddie Johnson continues to put frogs in his desk." This led to a discussion of her students, and Pearl was touched by how well Isaac remembered each child. She mentioned their strengths, their challenges, even small details about their personalities that she had shared in passing during previous conversations. After dinner, they moved to the chairs before the fire. Isaac brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Got something for you," he said, holding it out. Nothing fancy. Pearl hadn't expected a gift and felt a moment's embarrassment that she had nothing to offer in return. "Isaac, you shouldn't have. Open it," he interrupted gently. The package contained a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with delicate wildflowers. "It's beautiful," Pearl said, running her fingers over the detailed work. "Noticed you writing a lot. Thought you might need a new one." His voice was casual, but his eyes watched her carefully. "I did." Pearl was touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Her current journal was nearly full, its pages crammed with observations about her students, notes on teaching methods, and her own private reflections on her new life. "Thank you." "It's perfect. There's something else." Isaac rose and went to one of the bookshelves, returning with a worn volume. "Thought you might like to borrow this. Might help with some of your science lessons." It was a naturalist's guide to the flora and fauna of the Western Territories, beautifully illustrated with detailed engravings. Pearl opened it reverently, immediately recognizing its value as a teaching tool. "This is exactly what I've been hoping to find," she said, looking up at him with genuine delight. "Where did you get it?" "Army surgeon I knew during the war sent it. He knew I had an interest in such things." Isaac sat back down, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Keep it as long as you need." They spent the remainder of the afternoon in conversation that ranged from books they had read to places they had seen, from teaching methods to horse-breaking techniques. Pearl found herself sharing stories she had told no one else in White Rock, including, to her own surprise, a brief account of Thomas's abandonment. "He left a note," she concluded, staring into the fire rather than meeting Isaac's eyes. "Said he'd found better prospects in California and not to follow. After 3 years together." Isaac was quiet for a long moment. "Some men don't deserve the women who love them," he said finally, his voice low and intense. "Seems to me you're better off without a man who'd leave that way." Pearl looked up, startled by the emotion in his tone. "I believe I am," she said slowly, though it didn't feel that way at first. "And now?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond its simple words. Pearl considered carefully before answering. "Now I think perhaps it was the best thing that could have happened," she said truthfully. "I might never have come west otherwise. Never have found. She hesitated, unsure how to complete the thought without revealing too much. Found what? Isaac prompted, his blue eyes intent on her face. Myself, Pearl finished. My own strength. I needed to discover that I could survive disappointment and start again. Isaac nodded, something like approval warming his expression. You've done more than survive, Pearl. You've thrived here. The whole town sees it, especially the children. His praise warmed her more than the fire. They lapsed into comfortable silence as the winter afternoon waned toward evening, the room growing gradually darker until only the firelight illuminated their faces. When it came time to leave, Pearl found herself reluctant to end the day. Isaac seemed to share her sentiment, taking his time hitching the horses and finding extra blankets for the journey back to town. The drive back was mostly silent, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts as the stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky. When they reached Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, Isaac helped Pearl down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. Thank you for today, Pearl said, looking up at him in the starlight. It was the nicest Christmas I've had in years. For me too. He stood very still, his face half in shadow. Then, with a movement that seemed almost involuntary, he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers grazing her skin with butterfly lightness. Pearl's breath caught at the contact. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her and realized with sudden clarity that she wanted him to. But Isaac stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. Good night, Pearl, he said softly. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Isaac, she replied, unable to hide her disappointment entirely. He waited until she was safely inside before climbing back into the wagon and driving away. Pearl stood at the window, watching until his figure disappeared into the darkness, her emotions a confusing tangle of warmth, frustration, and something that felt dangerously like hope. January brought the coldest weather Pearl had ever experienced, days when the thermometer refused to rise above zero, when breath froze instantly in the air and the snow squeaked underfoot like crushed glass. School attendance became erratic as travel grew increasingly hazardous, and there were several days when Pearl had no choice but to cancel classes entirely. During one particularly severe cold snap, Pearl found herself virtually confined to the boarding house, the town's activities reduced to only the most essential functions. It was on the third day of this enforced idleness that Mrs. Wilson burst into the parlor where Pearl sat grading the few papers she had managed to collect before the storm. There's a situation at the Donovan place, she announced without preamble. New baby coming, and Ms. Donovan's having a hard time. Doctor can't get there, broke his leg last week, and he's laid up himself. Pearl set aside her work immediately. Is there anything I can do to help? That's why I'm telling you. Isaac Blackwood's here. Says he can get you out there if you're willing. Says you mentioned having some nursing experience. I assisted my aunt, who was a midwife in Boston, Pearl clarified, already rising to gather her things. But I'm not trained. You're what we've got, Mrs. Wilson said bluntly. That baby's coming whether there's a doctor or not, and Jane Donovan's alone except for her husband, who's about as useful as a cat at a cattle drive when it comes to birthing. Pearl hesitated only briefly. I'll need clean cloths, hot water when we arrive, and any medicines Mrs. Donovan might have in the house. Tell Isaac. He's waiting with the sleigh. Isaac had indeed procured a sleigh, a practical conveyance with runners that could navigate the deep snow far better than a wagon. He had lined it with furs and heated stones wrapped in flannel to ward off the bitter cold. You don't have to do this, he said as he helped Pearl into the sleigh. The Donovan place is 5 miles out, and this storm's not letting up. Of course I have to, Pearl replied, settling the lap robes around her. I couldn't live with myself if something happened and I hadn't tried to help. Isaac's expression was unreadable as he took his place beside her and picked up the reins. Thought you might say that. The journey was grueling. The wind drove snow horizontally across their path, reducing visibility to mere yards. Several times they had to stop while Isaac cleared drifts from their route or checked their bearings against landmarks that were barely discernible through the white haze. Almost there, he said after what seemed like hours, pointing toward a faint glow that gradually resolved itself into the lighted windows of a small farmhouse. The scene inside was one of barely controlled chaos. Jane Donovan, a young woman Pearl recognized as one of the mothers who occasionally brought eggs to the schoolhouse, lay pale and exhausted on a bed in the main room, her face contorted with pain as another contraction seized her. Her husband paced nearby, looking terrified and helpless. "Miss MacIntyre's here to help," Isaac announced, his calm voice cutting through the tension in the room. "She's assisted with births before." Pearl shed her outer garments and moved immediately to Jane's side, assessing the situation with what limited knowledge she possessed. The labor appeared to have been in progress for many hours, but the baby had not yet descended properly. "How far apart are the pains, Mrs. Donovan?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite her own apprehension. "Few minutes," Jane gasped. "But nothing's happening. Baby won't come." Pearl turned to Isaac and Mr. Donovan. "I need hot water, clean cloths, and privacy. Please wait outside." Mr. Donovan looked relieved at being dismissed, but Isaac met Pearl's eyes with a question in his own. "You sure you know what to do?" "No," Pearl admitted quietly. "But I know more than anyone else here, it seems." He nodded once. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." What followed was the most harrowing night of Pearl's life. Jane's labor progressed slowly, each contraction seeming to sap more of her dwindling strength. Pearl recalled everything her aunt had taught her about difficult births, but the reality was far more frightening than any theoretical knowledge. Several times she went to the door to ask Isaac to bring more hot water or clean linens. Each time, she found him waiting patiently just outside, ready to provide whatever was needed without question or complaint. "How is she?" he asked during one such exchange, his breath clouding in the frigid night air. "Struggling," Pearl answered honestly. "The baby's turned wrong, I think. I'm trying to remember what my aunt did in such cases." Isaac's hand came to rest briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of support that gave Pearl more comfort than she would have expected. "You're doing everything you can. That's all anyone could ask." Near dawn, with one final desperate effort from Jane and careful guidance from Pearl, the baby finally made its appearance, a robust boy with a healthy cry that filled the small house with its insistent demands for attention. "You have a son, Mrs. Donovan," Pearl announced, wrapping the infant in clean flannel before placing him in his mother's eager arms. A strong, healthy son. The joy and relief that transformed Jane's exhausted face made all the night's terrors worthwhile. Mr. Donovan, summoned from his anxious vigil, stood speechless at the sight of his wife and child, then burst into tears of gratitude. "We're naming him after my father," Jane said weakly, looking up at Pearl with shining eyes. "Unless you'd allow us to name him for you somehow." Pearl laughed, suddenly aware of how utterly drained she felt. "I think your father would be honored, Mrs. Donovan. And I certainly don't need a baby boy named Pearl." "We won't forget what you did," Mr. Donovan said fervently. "Riding out in that storm, staying all night. We owe you everything." "You owe me nothing," Pearl assured him. "I'm just glad I could help." She found Isaac in the kitchen, stoking the fire to heat more water. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. "Mother and baby are both well," Pearl reported, sinking onto a chair as the tension of the night finally caught up with her. "A boy." Relief crossed Isaac's face. "Good. That's good." He studied her with concern. "You look ready to drop, Pearl. When did you last sleep?" Pearl tried to remember and couldn't. The previous day seemed a lifetime ago. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "But we should start back soon, before the storm worsens." "Not yet." Isaac's tone brooked no argument. "You need rest, and the horses need a few hours' recovery. We'll leave at noon." Too exhausted to protest, Pearl allowed him to lead her to a small side room where a narrow bed had been prepared. She was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. She woke several hours later to find the storm had abated somewhat, though the sky remained heavy with the promise of more snow. Isaac had the sleigh ready, and after a final check on mother and child, they began the journey back to White Rock. "What you did last night was remarkable," Isaac said after they had been traveling for some time. Pearl shook her head. "I was terrified the entire time. If anything had gone wrong, but it didn't," he interrupted. "You kept your head and did what needed doing, despite your fear. That's courage, Pearl." She glanced at him, surprised by the admiration in his voice. "What about you? You drove through a blizzard to bring me there, then waited all night without complaint." "Nothing remarkable about that." His eyes remained fixed on the trail ahead. Any decent man would have done the same. I disagree. Most men would have decided it was too dangerous, or that Jane's situation wasn't their concern. Pearl studied his profile, struck again by the strength and kindness that seemed to coexist so naturally in him. "You're a good man, Isaac Blackwood." He made no reply, but something in his posture softened slightly, as if her words had touched him in a place he rarely allowed to be reached. They were halfway back to town when the sleigh runner struck a hidden obstruction beneath the snow. The impact threw them sideways, and though Isaac fought to control the startled horses, the sleigh tipped precariously before overturning completely. Pearl found herself flung into a snowbank, the breath knocked from her lungs. For a moment, she lay stunned, hearing only the panicked whinnying of the horses and the howl of the rising wind. "Pearl." Isaac's voice cut through her disorientation. He was beside her in an instant, his hands gentle as he helped her sit up. "Are you hurt?" Pearl took inventory of her limbs, relieved to find nothing worse than bruises and scrapes. "I don't think so. The snow broke my fall. What about you?" "I'm fine." But she noticed him wince as he helped her to her feet, and there was a dark stain spreading on the sleeve of his coat. "You're bleeding," she said, reaching for his arm. "It's nothing. Cut myself on the runner when we went over." He turned his attention to the sleigh, which lay on its side several yards away. The horses, thankfully, were still attached and unhurt, though visibly agitated. "Bigger problem is getting the sleigh upright. Not sure I can manage it alone." Pearl looked around, taking stock of their situation. They were miles from town, with the temperature dropping rapidly as afternoon waned toward evening. The storm was intensifying again, the brief lull giving way to stronger winds and heavier snowfall. "Could we ride the horses?" she suggested. Isaac shook his head. "They're not saddle-broke. And even if they were, they're too spooked now to be safe." He scanned the horizon, seeming to make a difficult calculation. "There's a line shack about half a mile east. Used it sometimes when checking fence lines. Basic shelter, might have some supplies. Can we walk that far in this?" Pearl gestured at the thickening snowfall. "Have to try." Isaac's expression was grim. "Temperatures dropping fast. Can't stay out here." He unhitched the horses, securing their reins to a stunted tree. "They'll be all right till morning," he said, seeing Pearl's concerned look. "Bred for this weather." Taking her hand firmly in his, Isaac led the way eastward, breaking trail through snow that was already knee-deep in places. Pearl struggled to keep pace, hampered by her long skirts and growing fatigue. The only blessing was that the wind was at their backs rather than driving directly into their faces. The line shack, when they finally reached it, was little more than a crude cabin, a single room with a small iron stove, a narrow cot, and shelves holding basic supplies. It was cold and musty from disuse, but it was shelter from the howling storm. "Not much," Isaac apologized as he worked to start a fire in the stove. "But it'll keep us alive till this blows over." Pearl was too cold to reply immediately. Her clothes were wet from snow, and she could no longer feel her toes inside her boots. She stood shivering by the door, watching as Isaac coaxed a small flame to life with practiced efficiency. "Come closer to the fire," he urged, helping her toward the stove. "Need to get you warm." His own face was pale with cold, and Pearl noticed again the bloodstain on his sleeve, larger now. "Let me see your arm first," she insisted. After a brief argument, Isaac reluctantly removed his coat and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a deep gash along his forearm. Pearl cleaned it as best she could with snow melted in a tin cup, then bound it with strips torn from her petticoat. "Should have been a doctor instead of a teacher," Isaac commented, watching her work with steady eyes despite what must have been considerable pain. "I'd make a terrible doctor," Pearl replied, tying off the makeshift bandage. "I faint at the sight of blood, my own, at least. Other people's doesn't seem to bother me as much." With the immediate medical concern addressed, they turned to the practical matter of surviving the night. Isaac found several wool blankets in a trunk, along with some jerky and a canister of coffee that, while stale, was still usable. "Not exactly the dinner I had planned to offer you," he said as they huddled near the stove, sharing the meager provisions. Pearl smiled despite her lingering chill. Better than freezing to death in a snowdrift. As night fell, the storm intensified, wind shrieking around the small cabin and driving snow through every crack in the rough-hewn walls. The temperature inside, while certainly better than the lethal cold outside, remained far from comfortable. "You should take the cot," Isaac said, arranging blankets on the floor for himself. Pearl shook her head firmly. "You're injured, and you've done all the physical work of getting us here and setting up. You take the cot." "Pearl, don't argue, Isaac. I'm perfectly capable of sleeping on the floor for one night." A faint smile crossed his face. "Stubborn woman." "So I've been told." Pearl wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, still shivering despite the fire's warmth. "Though I prefer determined." They settled into their respective sleeping arrangements, but Pearl found herself unable to get warm enough to sleep. The floor was hard and cold, and her damp clothing seemed to draw heat from her body rather than retain it. After an hour of listening to her unsuccessful attempts to suppress her shivering, Isaac spoke from the darkness. "This is foolish. We're both going to freeze separately when we could share warmth." Pearl was silent, considering the impropriety against the very real risk of hypothermia. "I'm not suggesting anything dishonorable," Isaac continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Just practical survival." "I know," Pearl said softly. "And you're right. The cot was narrow, designed for one person, but they managed to arrange themselves side by side, both still fully clothed, with the blankets spread over them. Isaac's body was solid and warm against Pearl's back, his arm cautiously placed around her waist to keep her from falling off the edge. "Better?" he asked, his breath stirring the hair at the nape of her neck. "Yes," Pearl admitted, feeling warmth gradually returning to her limbs. "Much better." She had expected to feel awkward or uncomfortable with such unprecedented proximity, but instead found herself relaxing into the simple human comfort of another person's warmth. The steady rhythm of Isaac's breathing was reassuring, a reminder that they were alive and safe despite the storm's fury. "Isaac," she whispered after a long silence. Thank you for everything today." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Get some sleep, Pearl," he said softly. "Morning will be here soon enough." Pearl closed her eyes, surrendering to exhaustion at last. Her last conscious thought was that she had never felt quite so safe as she did in that moment, despite the perilous circumstances that had brought them there. She woke to find sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window, the storm having spent its fury sometime during the night. Isaac was already up, rekindling the fire in the stove and melting snow for coffee. "Morning," he said, looking up as she stirred. "Storm's past. We can head back to town once we've had something warm to drink." Pearl sat up, acutely aware of how disheveled she must look after the previous day's ordeal. She did her best to smooth her hair and straighten her clothing, but there was little to be done without a mirror or fresh water. "Don't worry," Isaac said, correctly interpreting her self-conscious movements. "You look fine. Better than fine, actually." The compliment, delivered with such matter-of-fact sincerity, brought unexpected warmth to Pearl's cheeks. "I doubt that very much, but thank you for the kindness." They shared a sparse breakfast of coffee and the last of the jerky, then prepared to make the journey back to town. The horses, when they retrieved them, were huddled together in the lee of a snowdrift, looking miserable but unharmed. With Isaac's help, they managed to right the sleigh and continue their journey. The day was brilliantly clear, the snow-covered landscape dazzling in the morning sun, but Pearl found herself uncharacteristically quiet, her thoughts occupied with the events of the previous night. What did it mean that she had felt so comfortable in Isaac's arms? That she had slept more peacefully beside him in that crude cabin than she had in her proper bed at the boarding house for months? And what of the growing certainty that her feelings for him had moved well beyond friendship into territory that both excited and frightened her? They reached White Rock by mid-morning to find the town digging itself out from the storm. Their arrival caused an immediate stir, with Mrs. Wilson rushing out to meet them, her face creased with worry. "Thought you were frozen solid somewhere," she exclaimed. "When you didn't come back yesterday, got caught in the storm," Isaac explained briefly. "Had to shelter at a line shack east of the Donovan place." Mrs. Wilson's sharp eyes took in their disheveled appearance, Pearl's improvised bandage on Isaac's arm, and the obvious exhaustion in both their faces. To Pearl's relief, the older woman made no comment beyond, "Well, you're both home safe now, and that's what matters." The practical aftermath of their adventure, explanations to concerned townspeople, the necessary repairs to the sleigh, the treatment of Isaac's injury by the now mobile doctor occupied the remainder of the day. It wasn't until evening that Pearl had a moment alone with Isaac. He had come to the boarding house to return a shawl she had left in the sleigh, and they stood together on the front porch, the cold air crystallizing their breath between them. "How's your arm?" Pearl asked, nodding toward the proper bandage now visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Fine. Doctor said you did a good job cleaning it." Isaac shifted slightly, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Pearl, about last night. You don't need to say anything," she interrupted quickly. "We did what was necessary for survival. There's nothing improper to address." "That's not." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "What I meant to say is that I respect you, and I hope nothing that happened would make you uncomfortable around me." Pearl looked up at him, struck by the genuine concern in his expression. "Nothing did," she assured him. "If anything, She hesitated, then decided honesty was required. "I've never felt safer than I did with you, despite the circumstances." Something flickered in Isaac's eyes, a warmth that made Pearl's heart beat faster. "Good," he said softly. "That's good to know." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken current between them almost palpable in the cold night air. "I should go," Isaac said finally. "You need rest after everything." "Yes," Pearl agreed, though she felt a pang of disappointment. "Good night, Isaac." He touched the brim of his hat in his customary gesture, but paused before turning to leave. "Pearl," he said, his voice low and serious, "I want you to know that what I said about respecting you, it doesn't mean I don't have other feelings as well. I just wanted to be clear on that." Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness and leaving Pearl with her heart racing and her thoughts in turmoil. February brought a gradual thaw, both in the weather and in Pearl's relationship with Isaac. Their shared ordeal had created a bond that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. They began to seek each other's company more deliberately, Isaac finding reasons to visit the schoolhouse with books or supplies, Pearl occasionally riding out to his ranch on weekends to borrow volumes from his extensive library. These visits were conducted with perfect propriety, always in daylight, often with others present, but Pearl was increasingly aware of the growing attachment between them. It showed in small ways: the lingering of their hands when passing a book, the way Isaac's eyes followed her movements across a room, the ease with which they fell into conversation that could stretch for hours. What Pearl found most remarkable was how different this feeling was from what she had experienced with Thomas. That had been a giddy, almost desperate emotion, full of dramatic declarations and passionate promises. This was steadier, deeper, a quiet certainty that grew stronger with each encounter. The town, of course, noticed. Pearl became accustomed to knowing looks from Mrs. Wilson, not so subtle inquiries from Mrs. Humphrey about her intentions toward our most eligible bachelor, and the giggles of her older female students whenever Isaac happened to appear at the schoolhouse. "You've got yourself a regular caller, Miss MacIntyre," teased Jenny Marshall, a 15-year-old who was Pearl's most advanced student. "Ma says Mr. Blackwood never paid this much attention to anyone before you came." "Mr. Blackwood is a friend who shares my interest in literature and natural sciences," Pearl replied primly, though she couldn't entirely suppress a smile. "Now, back to your composition, please." Despite the growing closeness between them, Isaac had made no formal declaration of his feelings, and Pearl found herself in the unfamiliar position of being uncertain where she stood. She knew her own heart somewhere during the winter months. She had fallen deeply in love with the quiet, thoughtful man who had become such an important part of her life. But Isaac's feelings, while clearly warm, remained officially unspoken. The situation came to a head in early March when a letter arrived from Boston. Pearl recognized her mother's handwriting immediately and opened it with some trepidation, expecting the usual litany of complaints about her Western exile. Instead, she found news that left her reeling. Thomas had returned to Boston, apparently unsuccessful in his California ventures. He had called on Pearl's mother, expressing remorse for his abrupt departure and a desire to reconcile with Pearl. "He seems sincerely repentant," her mother wrote, "and has secured a very respectable position with your uncle's firm." I have taken the liberty of informing him that you are expected home for the summer holidays, at which time I believe he intends to renew his suit. While I understand he behaved poorly, dear, second chances are sometimes warranted, especially for a man of his prospects. Pearl set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. The very idea of reconciliation with Thomas was so foreign to her current feelings that it seemed almost laughable. The man who had abandoned her without a proper goodbye now expected her to welcome him back simply because his other prospects had failed? Yet her mother's assumption that she would naturally return to Boston for the summer gave her pause. When she had accepted the teaching position in White Rock, she had indeed planned to return east during the school break. But now, the thought of leaving Wyoming, leaving Isaac, even temporarily, made her heart constrict painfully. She was still contemplating the letter when a knock at her boarding house door announced Isaac himself. He had come to invite her to ride out to see the first wildflowers of spring, which were beginning to appear in a sheltered valley near his ranch. "Is something wrong?" he asked immediately, noting her distracted expression. Pearl hesitated, then handed him the letter. "From my mother," she explained. "Thomas, my former fiancé, has returned to Boston." Isaac's face remained carefully neutral as he read, but Pearl saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. When he looked up, his eyes were guarded in a way she hadn't seen for months. "Will you go?" he asked, his voice deliberately casual. "Back to Boston for the summer?" "I don't know," Pearl admitted. "I hadn't really thought about it until now. When I came here, I assumed I would, but now." "Now?" Isaac prompted when she didn't continue. Pearl met his gaze directly. "Now I'm not sure I want to leave, even temporarily." Something shifted in Isaac's expression, a softening, a warmth returning to his eyes. "Because of the school?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer was more complex. "Partly," Pearl acknowledged. "I've grown attached to the children, to the community. But that's not the only reason." They stood looking at each other, the unspoken hanging between them like a tangible thing. Pearl found herself holding her breath, waiting for Isaac to speak the words she had been longing to hear. But Isaac merely nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "I should let you think about your mother's letter," he said, stepping back slightly. "We can ride to see the flowers another day." Disappointment washed over Pearl, sharper for having allowed herself to hope. "Of course," she said, striving to keep her voice even. Another day would be fine. After Isaac left, Pearl found herself restless and unable to concentrate on her usual evening tasks. The letter had disturbed her equilibrium, not because of any lingering feelings for Thomas, but because it had brought her own feelings for Isaac into such sharp relief. She loved him, loved his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, his profound respect for her mind and capabilities. And she believed he cared for her as well. So why did he hold back from declaring himself? The answer came to her with sudden clarity. He was giving her the choice. Unlike Thomas, who had made decisions without consulting her, Isaac was ensuring that any step forward would be her own free decision, not influenced by pressure from him. The realization both touched and frustrated her. His consideration was admirable, but Pearl found herself wishing, just this once, that he would be less restrained in expressing his feelings. The next day at school, Pearl found it difficult to focus on her lessons. Her thoughts kept returning to Isaac and the question of her return to Boston. By the time the children were dismissed, she had made her decision. Instead of returning to the boarding house, Pearl set out for Isaac's ranch. The 5-mile walk gave her ample time to consider what she would say, but when she finally arrived, her carefully prepared speech deserted her. Isaac was in the barn, brushing down a young mare. He looked up in surprise as Pearl appeared in the doorway. "Pearl, is everything all right?" "No," she said honestly. "Everything is not all right, Isaac Blackwood, and I believe you know why." He set down the brush, his expression cautious. "Why don't you tell me?" "Because I'm in love with you," Pearl stated, the directness of her own declaration surprising even herself. "I have been for some time now, and I hope that you feel the same way about me. But for some reason, you won't say it." Isaac went very still, his eyes never leaving her face. "Pearl, please let me finish," she interrupted. "I'm not going back to Boston, not for Thomas, not for my mother, not for anyone. This is my home now. You are my home now, if you want me to be. But I need to hear you say it, Isaac. I need to know that I'm not alone in this." For a moment, Isaac remained silent, and Pearl felt a flicker of doubt. Had she misread everything? Had her feelings been one-sided all along? Then Isaac closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness. "You're not alone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God, Pearl, I've loved you since Christmas, maybe before. But I couldn't say it. Not when you might still want to go back east. Not when you deserved better than a broken-down cowboy with nothing to offer but a ranch and a heart that's been too long without someone to care for. That's all I want," Pearl whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "Just you, just as you are." "I'm not leaving, Pearl," Isaac said softly, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to fall despite her best efforts. "Not ever. Whatever happens, whatever comes, I'll be right here with you. That's a promise I intend to keep." And then, finally, his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the tenderness and passion she had dreamed of but never truly expected to find. Pearl wound her arms around his neck, returning the kiss with equal fervor, feeling as though something long incomplete within her had finally found its missing piece. When they broke apart, both breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I should have told you months ago," he murmured. "Been driving myself crazy trying to give you space, trying not to pressure you." Pearl laughed softly. "And I've been waiting for you to speak first, like some ridiculous heroine in a novel." "We're quite a pair," Isaac agreed, smiling in a way that transformed his usually serious face. "But I think we'll manage, as long as we start talking to each other more clearly. I believe we've made a good beginning today," Pearl said, reaching up to touch his face, still somewhat awed that she could do so freely now. Isaac captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth spiraling through her. "Stay for dinner?" he asked. "I promise not to get us stranded in a blizzard this time." "I'd like that," Pearl replied, happiness bubbling up within her like a spring. "Though I have to say, that night in the line shack wasn't entirely unpleasant." "No," Isaac agreed, his eyes darkening slightly as he drew her closer. "But I think we can find more comfortable accommodations in the future." The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. Pearl knew there would be challenges: her mother's disapproval, the adjustment to life as a couple rather than individuals, the inevitable hardships of frontier existence. But for the first time since coming west, she felt truly certain of her path. Isaac Blackwood wasn't her first love, but he was the first who meant it when he said, "I'm not leaving." And that, Pearl knew with bone-deep certainty, made all the difference. Their courtship proceeded with a swiftness that scandalized some of White Rock's more conservative residents but delighted most of the community. Isaac was well respected, and Pearl had earned the town's affection through her dedication to the school and her willingness to help during crises like the Donovan birth. They were married in late May, just after the school term ended, in a simple ceremony at the town's small church. Pearl wore a new dress of pale blue silk ordered specially from Denver at Isaac's insistence, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Isaac, unrecognizable to many in his new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. "Never seen a man look at a woman quite like that," Mrs. Wilson commented to Mrs. Humphrey as they watched the ceremony. "Like she's water, and he's been in the desert his whole life." The couple made their home at Isaac's ranch, with Pearl riding into town each day during the school term to continue teaching. Their evenings were spent in shared activities, Pearl helping Isaac with the ranch accounts, Isaac assisting Pearl with preparations for her lessons, both of them reading aloud from favorite books before the fire. Summer brought its own rhythms: the hard work of haying, the constant vigilance required by the horse breeding operation, the community gatherings for Independence Day, and barn raisings. Pearl discovered unexpected joy in ranch life, finding that her Boston upbringing had not prepared her for the satisfaction of growing her own vegetables or the pride in learning to ride as confidently as any Wyoming native. She wrote to her mother, explaining her marriage and her decision to remain permanently in Wyoming. The reply, when it came, was predictably disapproving, but Pearl found that her mother's opinion no longer held the weight it once had. Her life was here now, with Isaac, and she had no regrets about the path she had chosen. Thomas wrote, as well, a letter filled with protestations of renewed devotion and assurances that his brief lapse in judgment should not stand between them. Pearl read it once, then consigned it to the fire without response. No second thoughts? Isaac asked, watching the paper curl and blacken among the flames. Pearl shook her head, moving to sit beside him on the porch steps. Not one. Thomas was a chapter that ended long before I met you. Isaac's arms settled around her shoulders, drawing her close against his side. Glad to hear it, Mrs. Blackwood, he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. Because I've grown rather fond of having you around. Have you indeed? Pearl teased, tilting her face up to his. And here I thought you married me for my excellent reading voice. That too. Isaac agreed solemnly, though his eyes danced with humor. Among other qualities. Their kiss was interrupted by the arrival of one of the ranch hands, bringing news of a mare about to foal. Isaac rose reluctantly. Duty calls. Don't wait up, could be a long night. I'll bring you coffee later, Pearl promised. She watched him stride toward the barn, still sometimes amazed at how completely her life had changed in less than a year. From a Boston schoolteacher with a broken engagement to a Wyoming rancher's wife, it was a transformation she could never have imagined. Yet it felt right in a way nothing else ever had, as if all the disappointments and false starts had been leading her precisely here, to this place and this man. As autumn approached, bringing with it the start of a new school term, Pearl discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled Isaac with a mixture of joy and anxiety that Pearl found endearing. The capable, self-sufficient rancher suddenly fretting over whether she was eating enough or resting properly. I'm perfectly healthy, she assured him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. I know, Isaac acknowledged, his hand gently covering the still flat plane of her abdomen. But not my wife. Not carrying my child. The wonder in his voice made Pearl's heart swell with emotion. She covered his hand with her own, leaning her head against his shoulder. We're going to be fine, she said softly. All three of us. Isaac nodded, his thumb tracing small circles against her stomach. I know, he said again, more confidently this time. Because we're in this together. Together, Pearl agreed, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Just as you promised. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Isaac pulled her close against him, his hand once again finding its way to the place where their child grew. You know, he said quietly, when I bought this ranch, I thought it would just be me here until the end. Never imagined having a family again. Again, Pearl repeated, curious about his choice of words. Isaac was silent for a moment, and she felt him take a deep breath before continuing. Had a wife, back before the war. Sarah. And a daughter, not even a year old. Influenza took them both while I was away fighting. Came home to empty graves and an empty house. Pearl turned in his arms to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the darkness. Oh, Isaac, she whispered. Why didn't you tell me? Couldn't talk about it for years, he admitted. By the time I met you, it felt like someone else's story, something that happened to a different man. And then when I started falling for you, I was afraid of what? Pearl prompted gently when he didn't continue. Afraid you'd think I was comparing you to her. Afraid you'd feel like you were living in a ghost shadow. His hand came up to stroke her hair. But that's not how it is, Pearl. Sarah was my first love, and I'll always carry her memory. But you're my second chance at happiness, at a real life. And I thank God every day that you walked into that stagecoach station. Pearl pressed closer, her heart aching for the losses he had endured, but also swelling with love for the man who had found the courage to open himself to love again despite such pain. Thank you for telling me, she said softly, for trusting me with that part of yourself. No more secrets between us, Isaac promised, his lips finding hers in the darkness. Just truth, from here on out. Just truth, Pearl echoed. And love. And a future that's ours to build together. The future they built exceeded even their most hopeful expectations. Their son, William James Blackwood, was born the following spring, a healthy, robust child with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined temperament. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Elizabeth, whose arrival coincided with the expansion of the Blackwood Ranch into one of the most successful horse breeding operations in the territory. Pearl continued teaching until their third child was on the way, at which point she reluctantly retired from the schoolhouse to focus on educating her own growing brood and helping Isaac manage the increasingly complex ranch business. She never regretted the decision, finding that her teaching skills were just as valuable at home as they had been in the classroom. As the years passed, White Rock grew from a frontier outpost into a proper town, with a bank, a hotel, and eventually a railroad spur that brought increased prosperity and new settlers. The Blackwoods became fixtures in the community, Isaac serving terms on the town council, Pearl organizing the first proper library, both of them opening their home to newcomers and neighbors in need. Through it all, the good years and the lean ones, the joys of watching their children grow and the sorrows of losing friends and family, to time's inevitable passage, they remained each other's steadfast companions. The passionate love of their early marriage mellowed but never diminished, deepening instead into a partnership so complete that neighbors often joked they could finish each other's sentences. On their 20th anniversary, with their oldest son preparing to attend college back east and their youngest just starting school, Isaac surprised Pearl with a trip to Boston to visit her aging mother. It was Pearl's first return since leaving as a heartbroken young woman, and she found the city both familiar and strange, like a dress she had outgrown but kept for sentimental reasons. "Do you ever regret it?" Isaac asked as they stood on Boston Common, surrounded by the elegant buildings and cultivated gardens of the city where Pearl had grown up. "Leaving all this for Wyoming?" Pearl looked up at her husband, his face more weathered now, threads of silver mingling with the brown in his hair, but his blue eyes still as clear and direct as the day they had met. "Not for a single moment," she said truthfully. "This was where I was born, but Wyoming is where I found my life. Where I found you." Isaac's arm tightened around her waist, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Lucky for me that Thomas turned out to be such a fool," he observed, a hint of his rare smile playing around his mouth. Pearl laughed, the sound drawing curious glances from passing Bostonians and used to such unrestrained expression in public. "Lucky for us both," she agreed. "Though I think we would have found each other somehow, even without his poor decisions to push me westward." "You believe that?" Isaac asked, looking down at her with genuine curiosity. "I do," Pearl said firmly. "Some things are meant to be, Isaac. We were meant to be." He nodded slowly, as if considering this idea. "Maybe you're right. All I know for certain is that when I promised I wasn't leaving, it was the truest thing I've ever said. And when I believed you," Pearl replied, rising on tiptoes to press a kiss to his cheek, heedless of the scandalized looks from nearby ladies, "it was the wisest decision I ever made." Hand in hand, they turned away from the manicured paths of Boston Common, both knowing that while they had enjoyed their visit, their hearts belonged to the wild, open spaces of Wyoming and to each other, now and always.